Welcome. Good afternoon to everyone on East Coast time at least. This is an event for the Institute for Islamic Christian and Jewish Studies. We try to do these about once a month on timely topics, and I don't know that there's any more timely topic than the presidential election that's coming up. We're excited to have you here. My name is Matt Taylor. I am the Protestant scholar at ICJS. And I'm very excited to introduce you to my friend, Youssef Chouhoud, who is a professor, a political scientist at Christopher Newport University. He's also a public fellow with the Public Religion Research Institute in Washington, D.C. And just a quick anecdote about Youssef. I actually met Youssef at a conference a number of years ago. It was the North American Association of Islamic and Muslim Studies, and I was presenting a paper on this very important educational institution for American Muslims called Al-Maghrib Institute, and kind of the history of Al-Maghrib and the importance of it in the Muslim community. And Yusuf comes up to me after my presentation, like, "Well, I actually was involved in Al-Maghrib when I was a young man, when I was a teenager." And so what I appreciate about Yusuf is he is both a political scientist who studies American Muslim community and their politics and how they're involved in American politics, but he's also a member of that community, and he's involved and connected and relationally enmeshed within that community. And I think that he just brings a unique perspective to these topics. So welcome, Youssef. Thank you for being here.
Thank you very much for that generous introduction, Matt. Absolute pleasure being here.
Great. Well, so I'm going to assume that not everyone is totally familiar with all of the contours of the American Muslim community, and we often find in surveys that people way overestimate how many Muslims there are in the United States. So maybe we could just start off. You could kind of sketch for us the landscape of American Islam, the demographics, ethnic and racial makeup, geographical distribution, and maybe just a little bit of the history of how we got to the present moment.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd be happy to. So the first thing to note, I guess, is that the history of Muslims in America actually predates the founding of America, and you probably know where I'm going with this. So historians estimate that about 15 to 30% of enslaved Africans were Muslims, many of whom were sent to America or what would become America. Now, of course, the practice of Islam, like other aspects of African heritage, was often seen as a threat to the complete domination that slaveholders sought over their captives. And so enslaved Muslims' connections to their faith and, would gradually erode over generations due to obviously the systemic brutality of slavery, isolation from fellow Muslims, and to a certain extent, some forced Christianization in there as well. Nonetheless, the most visible expression of Islam before the 1960s, came from African American communities, particularly through movements like the Nation of Islam, the NOI, whose teachings, though distinct from Sunni Islam, framed Islam as a source of empowerment for African Americans in the face of systemic racism and segregation. So this was the case until the 1960s, and the reason that I single out that period is because in 1965, the Immigration and Naturalization Act gets passed and dramatically changes the landscape of Islam in America, as it allowed for significant immigration from countries such as Pakistan, Egypt, Iran, and many other Muslim majority nations. But this wasn't kind of an immediate shift. In fact, the latest Pew Research survey of American Muslims, which came out in 2017, so it's been a little while now, but nonetheless, they found that a majority of foreign-born Muslims in the U.S. Entered the country after the year 2000. And moreover, a majority of Muslims overall are first-generation immigrants. And then if you add kind of second-generation immigrants to that tally, then you're looking at somewhere around three-quarters of the American Muslim population. In terms of the broader society, American Muslims are perhaps 1.5% or so of the overall population. And like many other kind of immigrant communities, tend to be concentrated in kind of certain areas of the country. So the New York metro area, so New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and I guess you can throw in Boston too. Well, throw them a bone. Northern Virginia, the DMV area, has a large contingent of Muslims as well. Many Black American Muslims are concentrated in Philadelphia, Detroit, and Atlanta. And you also have kind of large Black immigrant communities from Somalia and Sudan, especially in the Twin Cities in Minnesota, as well as in the Chicagoland area. Then you have large Arab and South Asian communities in Dallas, Houston, Los Angeles, and the Bay Area. The Bay Area, you'll find there a noticeable population of immigrants from Afghanistan as well. Of course, you have Michigan, which is home to the largest concentration of Arabs and Muslims. Of course, I'll just note, I'm sure your audience knows this, but I'll just note it as well, that not all Arabs are Muslims, not all Muslims are Arabs. And in this country, especially, this is an important point to make because based on available data, it seems that a majority of Arabs are actually non-Muslim. So that's just, kind of something to keep in mind. So to just kind of wrap up, Muslims are arguably the most diverse religious community in America in terms of racial ethnic background, as well as the youngest in terms of, yes, average age, kind of demographically, but in terms of their institutions as well. The vast majority of mosques in the US were built in the past 3 decades. So hopefully that overview kind of provides, a foundation for our conversation.
No, that is very helpful, and I think what I appreciate about that is it shows us, right, that this is there's a very long history to this community, but then things have really accelerated in terms of the numbers and even the geographic spread, the ethnic diversity within the last really 30, 40 years, and especially since the year 2000 and since 9/11. So maybe you could talk a little bit about the political history of the
Mm.
American Muslim community. How has it evolved? How has this community approached American politics historically? And obviously, we're going to get into everything with the present moment and this election soon. But just kind of the broad sweep of that history, maybe up through the mid 2010s. How have American Muslims kind of thought, or what has been kind of the points of tension or debate within the community around American politics?
Yeah, so again, it's probably in the history of African Americans that you'll find kind of the most salient example of early American Muslim political action, specifically in the person of Malcolm X. Now he was kind of a force unto himself, and of course did not have, unfortunately, the opportunity to kind of organize in a way that would have had a more lasting kind of institutional legacy. Kind of given what I mentioned earlier about how young this community is and how kind of nascent, their political identity is as a result, a better starting point is perhaps kind of the late 1990s. And so this is when we first see kind of a concerted effort among largely immigrant or immigrant community Muslims organizing around the 2000 election, and in particular, and this may be a surprise to some in the audience, in particular, kind of pushing those communities, pushing American Muslims in general to vote for George W. Bush. And so this was, from their perspective, kind of the natural home for American Muslims, because, as a community with kind of socially conservative leanings, as well as, a community with this kind of abiding entrepreneurial, kind of ethos. The Republican Party seemed to kind of speak to those values a bit more. In addition, and this is, not incidental and obviously kind of ties into what I'm sure we're going to be talking about later on. The vice presidential candidate for the Democrats in that 2000 election was Joseph Lieberman, and he was seen as, far too kind of staunchly supportive of Israel. And I'll be frank, there was certainly some measure of anti-Semitism besides. I mean, you're going to find that unfortunately in any community. So that was where American Muslims were. And I do want to emphasize though that this was still kind of largely a movement to kind of block vote within the immigrant community. African Americans during this period, they were still pretty wary of the Republican Party, obviously given kind of the legacy of the Republican Party and the legacy of the Democratic Party within those communities. Uh, so things change, as you might imagine, post 9/11, and it changed fairly dramatically. It's basically kind of like a 180 in terms of vote share for the Republican candidate versus vote share for the Democratic candidate. So from 2000 basically to today, American Muslims are largely a community that votes for the Democratic Party, certainly in terms of the presidential elections. In terms of, what they were concentrating on in that post 9/11 era, again, unsurprisingly, it was very much kind of a focus on foreign policy, and how they could potentially push back against some of the, oversteps, I guess we can say, of the American government, particularly in the Middle East. Incidentally, too, one of the reasons that American Muslim groups were kind of pushing to vote for George W. Bush, because he was actually seen as less interventionist, especially when it comes to the Middle East. So in terms of bad calls, man, that one's kind of up there. So that immediate aftermath of kind of post 9/11, focus on foreign policy, understandably so. Then with the Obama presidency, and particularly in kind of the midpoint of the first term of the Obama presidency, so with the 2010 midterms, things started to focus more on domestic policy, and that wasn't incidental as well, because it's with that 2010 midterm election cycle that we really get this kind of ramping up of anti-Muslim rhetoric. This was when we had talk of the Ground Zero mosque and kind of the backlash towards that, and so there was a lot of kind of anti-Muslim rhetoric kind of animating the discourse around that election cycle. And so basically from around 2010, and certainly from the 2016 election onward, there has been a focus more so on domestic concerns, combating Islamophobia, having a more kind of proactive rather than reactive agenda, kind of more broadly on a number of fronts, not just simply those issues that most specifically kind of affect American Muslims, but, kind of social justice issues more generally. And you also see kind of this ramping up of institutions kind of geared towards consolidating American Muslim power, through various PACs and through various other kind of nonprofit institutions that seek to kind of get American Muslims to kind of run for office, which quite a few did, particularly at the local and state level over the past couple of cycles. And just in general, we kind of see a more a political maturity. Still again, kind of very kind of nascent, but you see kind of American Muslims kind of moving away from these kind of default positions of we only care about X, where X is quite frequently something happening outside of America. That was, of course, until kind of very recently.
So for our audience, if you have questions as we're going along, feel free to put those in the chat. We're going to have a Q&A time at the end, or last 15 minutes or so. So just maybe to summarize what I'm hearing here, Youssef. So we have a very diverse community, very much shaped by immigration experiences, especially since 1965. It is there's this kind of tension in there between this kind of foreign policy and Islamophobia pull or push maybe that is pushing the Muslim community in certain directions, but then also social conservatism that is kind of drawing them more towards kind of Republican sensibility, at least before the 2000 election. So that's this dynamic that's emerging. So I want to get to the present moment, but I just want to do one more table setting question and think about the Trump era.
Yeah.
Because arguably, I would argue we're still in the Trump era. He's still dominating our politics. But thinking about this kind of maybe the period before October 7th, before Hamas attacks Israel, before the Gaza war, like that period from 2016 to October 7th of last year, what were the evolutions going on among American Muslims politically during that period? Obviously, you've got the Muslim ban, right? They're like Islam is kind of front and center in our politics. Islamophobia is very present. But then as you noted, there's also this pull towards more domestic and conservative social elements. So how did things evolve during that period?
Yeah, so, for the 2016 election, there really wasn't yeah, it was pretty much, kind of business as usual in terms of, the presidential election cycle, in terms of, kind of focus on obviously kind of combating the rhetoric coming out of the Republican candidate for president in that cycle. And then, after that election, kind of combating not just the rhetoric, but the policies coming out of the administration. But as you noted, from that election, kind of moving onward, there was this kind of rightward pull or push, how I guess however you want to put it, right? With regards to American Muslims and the things that they began to kind of focus more on, the things that began to become more salient. In the 2000 election, we see this, kind of, coming to the fore in terms of vote share for the first time, effectively since the year 2000. So it had been like a basically 2 decade period of, kind of overwhelming, and it's still in 2020, you still had kind of an overwhelming majority of Muslims kind of voting Democratic. But if I can perhaps share some data with you in terms of, like what we saw that electoral cycle. So the thing that a lot of American Muslims and folks who were kind of concerned with what American Muslims were doing politically. The thing that they woke up to the next day was this graph right here, which is coming out of the AP Votecast. And if you notice, yes, a majority of Muslims, kind of voted for Joe Biden, but over a third voted for Donald Trump, and that's not a little bit, right? Like that's something quite meaningful. And so when you see this kind of seeming, overnight shift almost, right? You have to ask, like, what is going on there? And so the answer is that it really wasn't an overnight shift. It was something of this, kind of creeping shift. And so in the kind of rhetoric that was advancing from that period, from 2016 to 2020, particularly during the summer of 2020, right, with a lot of kind of social justice issues kind of coming to the fore. It seems that a lot of Muslims began to kind of reconsider, where their allegiances were kind of more naturally. Like what, who is the party that kind of best represents us? Not necessarily the candidate, but the party and the party values that best represent us. Again, this wasn't kind of a widespread phenomenon, but it certainly wasn't a kind of minimal, negligible phenomenon, right? And so based on, the 2020 election and based on the fact that, you ask American Muslims in surveys, and we can perhaps talk about, how you should perhaps be a little cautious about American Muslim surveys, but nonetheless, right, with the data that we do have at our disposal, they are, a fairly socially conservative community. And so it would make sense that you would have this kind of push towards the Republican Party. And then most recently, in the summer of, gosh, the years just kind of melt together now. I want to say the summer of 2023. So I want to say last summer, perhaps. You had a bunch of these kind of social conservative issues kind of bubble up, not just within the American Muslim community, but in the political landscape more generally, particularly when it came to issues with regard to materials that would be taught in school, right? You perhaps saw a number of these kind of board meetings, school board meetings, where American Muslims, in Michigan and Maryland, were, very much kind of animated in their kind of opposition to the direction that, certain schools were going. And the type of arguments that they were putting forth, the rhetoric that they were putting forth, was very much aligned with perhaps something that you would hear coming out of Moms for Liberty, right? And so to a certain extent, I don't want to kind of, overstate it, but to a certain extent, American Muslims kind of in the lead up to the 2024 election were effectively, how should I put this? They were conscripted into the culture wars, and on one side in particular, and so I was fully expecting, right, in the 2024 election, that we would see at least the same percentage voting for the Republican candidate for president, if not much higher. I wouldn't have been surprised if we saw, like a solid 40% of American Muslims voting for the Republican candidate. That was, of course, until October 7th.
Yeah, so let's go there. But it's interesting to think about that, right? You have a community that is more socially conservative overall,
Hmm.
but more democratic leaning politically since 9/11. But it sounds like at least in the 2020 election, we're starting to see maybe more of a reversion to the mean, right?
Yeah,
The community kind of more gravitating back into that kind of more socially conservative mode. And then October 7th happens,
yeah.
right? And Hamas attacks Israel, brutal, awful attack. Israel invades Gaza, right? And this launches a whole new period in American Muslim politics. So I want to think about that period between October 7th of last year and
Hmm.
then the middle of July when Biden gets out. And if folks were kind of watching the Democratic primaries, they probably noticed that there was this whole opt out
Yeah.
campaign, right? In some of these different primary states, especially the swing states, of Muslim voters trying to use and leverage their demographic power within the Democratic Party to send a message. And so could you kind of speak to what the themes were in that kind of, I don't know, 9, 10 month period? And also just what were the principles behind kind of the opt-out approach? And was that message directed at Joe Biden, or was it more directed at the Democratic Party in general?
Okay, that last one might take a little unpacking, but let me tell you a little bit about kind of the immediate aftermath of the horrific attack on October 7th, and obviously the ongoing horrific events in Gaza. So early on, I mean, it no one really expected that there was going to be this kind of severing of ties, right, between America and Israel. To this day, I mean, the folks who are kind of advocating for a change in policy are not advocating for a reset, right, to, like, I don't know, pre-1948 or something like that, like in terms of, kind of relations with the region. Like that's not in the offing. No one really thinks that's the case. But what struck American Muslims, what struck Arab Americans, again, I want to say, though, not exclusively American Muslims, not exclusively Arab Americans. I mean, a lot of folks of conscience besides. What struck them was just the ideological bent to what Joe Biden was doing, and how he was kind of viewing the ongoing conflict in Gaza. It seemed, pretty evident that he almost kind of valued Israeli lives more than Palestinian lives. And, the rhetoric that he was saying with regards to, kind of the conflict, basically kind of reinforced that vision, right? That image that he had. And so initially people were, kind of they were still in the kind of practical camp, right? Because it was still, hey, if the election was held today, we like the vast majority was still saying, like, we can't very well let, Donald Trump, have another term in office, right? But that kind of view of things began to erode fairly quickly. And as the days turned into weeks, turned into months, right, with regards to the assault on Gaza, it became clear that, some more concerted effort, some more forceful action was needed on the part of American Muslims, on the part of Arab Americans. And so, yes, you got this kind of uncommitted movement to really showcase, right, the power of these communities at the ballot box, which is, presumably what all politicians, kind of look to in terms of, the ultimate measure of, like, does your group kind of matter? Unfortunately, right? Like that's the way it kind of works. And so you had, this effort on the part of the uncommitted movement that went and, had 100,000 vote uncommitted in the primary in Michigan, which is a large number of people. Now, to be fair, the margin of victory in 2020 was 150,000 in favor of Joe Biden, but it was less than 15,000 in 2016, right, in favor of Donald Trump. And so Michigan is always going to be something of a concern, right? You certainly couldn't be able to take it for granted, right, if you're a Democratic candidate. And then you had large numbers again voting uncommitted in Wisconsin, in Minnesota, right? And there you actually had the number of uncommitted voters actually larger than the margin of victory in 2020. And so this was a strong signal, right, that the uncommitted movement was sending, to your last question, I think to the Democratic Party more broadly, that you can't simply take this group for granted, and just think that fear of the alternative is going to be enough to kind of get them to vote for your candidate in the affirmative. And I'm not sure that that has changed all that much today.
Great. Okay. So yeah, I want to come to today.
Yeah.
But I think it's interesting to think about, because we started off thinking about this geographic distribution of the Muslim community, and I noticed that you named a number of swing states when you
Yeah.
were describing the spread of the Muslim community, right? Because not necessarily intentionally, but the Muslim community, even though they're about 1.5% of the population, are very strategically located in swing states.
Yeah.
And what we were observing, and I think people weren't necessarily fully tracking or paying close enough attention, was that even as you have people voting uncommitted in the primary, so as you were noting, some of those vote counts were larger than the margin of victory in 2016 and 2020, right? So it really was a thing that could swing the 2024 election just based on the Muslim vote. And so and when we even first kind of planned this, Joe Biden was still the candidate, right? And so now we've had this kind of tidal shift
Mhm.
in the Democratic Party. Joe Biden has left the race. Kamala Harris and Tim Walz are now the ticket. And so I want to kind of think about how have things changed for from the perspective of the Muslim community. If the message was more about directed to the Democratic Party, did the Democratic Party get the message, or has Kamala Harris significantly changed things? And what's the dynamic now? What's the conversation going on now among American Muslims now that you have an African American and immigrant background female at the top of the Democratic ticket, right? And Donald Trump on the other side. What's the conversation going on now? And have you noticed any trends in the numbers since Harris came onto the ticket?
No, excellent question. So, let me perhaps kind of give a nod to the title for this talk, and kind of give you some numbers, right, with regards to whether or not, right, the Muslim vote actually kind of could potentially matter. I will say before I share this screen, this is a lot of numbers. This is a spreadsheet. If you're not a numbers person, listen, I totally get it. I'm a nerd. I acknowledge that. But let me just kind of walk you through it, right? And I believe, this is publicly available too. You can feel free to kind of check it out at your leisure later on, and email me about it besides. But so here is a kind of empirical analysis that I ran. Um, to my knowledge, I think it might be the only empirical analysis of American Muslim and Arab American voting power. And so what did I do here? Well, so for each one of these kind of critical states, I try to get the numbers with regards to eligible voters from both both the Muslim as well as the Middle Eastern community. And then, kind of based on polling data, kind of estimate, how they voted in 2020. And then, kind of extrapolating from that, what would the effect be, right? If they were to kind of defect from, the Democratic Party en masse in 2024. So this final column here gives you kind of the net Biden vote share, right? Rounded. And again, I'm not going to go through the whole thing because, we'd probably lose half the audience to sleep, let alone, them just kind of checking out. But if you look at this, right, like there is a significant, like just looking at kind of like the raw numbers, the fact that, effectively, half of the margin of victory was in Michigan, could be, attributed not solely, but could be attributed to the Muslim and Minna vote there. I mean, that's not insignificant, right? So now let's look at what would happen if they were to kind of defect en masse. So this is where I need to make some assumptions. I'll let you judge if they're kind of Herculean assumptions or not. But what I have down here, and this is kind of like the main kind of takeaway, right? So for every kind of 10% decrease in the percentage that voted for one of the two major parties in 2020, if 10% of them said, you know what, based on everything that's going on, we are not voting for either one of these parties, we are either going to abstain, right? Or we're going to vote third party. So for every decrease in this two-party turnout, right? For every 10% decrease, you can expect a loss of around 13,500 votes, net votes, right, for the Democratic candidate. This is assuming, the vast majority of those defecting are Democrats, which I think is a fairly safe bet, right? So what does this mean? If half of the voters, right, were to effectively say like, we're not voting in this election, or we're voting third party, then you start to really kind of see very large numbers, right, in terms of kind of vote share being taken away from the Democratic candidate. You have something on the order of 75,000 votes, right, in Michigan. You have something on the order of 20,000 votes in Georgia. So now I guess the question is, is that too large of an assumption, right? Is it too much to think that, half of American Muslim, of Arab American voters are going to kind of defect, either vote third party or abstain? I mean, that might be an underestimate based on, what we're seeing in polls. There was an early poll that came out from the one of those institutions that I was talking about that, in the wake of the Trump election, kind of came together to kind of consolidate American Muslim political action, Mgage. So they put out a poll. And, they had a poll of, how did you vote in 2020 and would you vote the same way now? So around, 75% of respondents said that they were voting, that they voted for Joe Biden in 2020. It was in the low teens, right? In terms of would you vote for him now? This was in November, right? So this was like not long after the war in Gaza started. And so there was a very clear sense that there was going to be a really large defection. And that, just solely based on American Muslim and Arab American defection, Biden was going to see like really low numbers. So how has that changed now that Kamala Harris is the nominee, no longer presumptive nominee, the nominee, right, for the Democratic Party? Well, it doesn't seem there was initially a honeymoon period, right, as there always is, right? And I think a lot of folks kind of wanted to give her the benefit of the doubt. Um, because, her rhetoric was, more empathetic, right, to the plight of Palestinians throughout all these months. But I think at this point, American Muslims it's too late for just, like your rhetoric is an improvement. Like, no, your policies have to be an improvement, based on, what we've been seeing in the past. And it doesn't look like, that we're getting any indication that that would be the case. And so the latest kind of polling numbers that we have, again, with a grain of salt, that we have with regards to how American Muslims would vote in key swing states, shows that there is a large contingent, a plurality in many states in support of Jill Stein. Um, a not small contingent that would vote for Kamala Harris, but certainly nowhere near the numbers that we saw back in 2020. And you can see in Michigan, that's actually where we see the lowest numbers, the lowest percentage of voters that would vote for Kamala Harris. And that's kind of where things stand at this point. But I think that a lot of American Muslims are still they find themselves in this position of the kind of the unicorn, right? That vaunted undecided voter, but it's not undecided between two of the major candidates. It's undecided whether or not you're going to vote for a major candidate or not, for the most part.
So let me see if I'm accurately summarizing here. So it sounds like, because we posed in the title of our event, could the Muslim vote swing the election? It sounds like you are giving a very tentative yes,
Mhm.
but saying it's really more of a question. It's less a question of will Muslim voters vote for Donald Trump,
Mhm.
and more a question, will Muslim voters vote at all?
Yeah,
That is the question that a lot of this is actually hinging on.
absolutely.
Is that fair?
Yeah, I think that's fair, and I think that really kind of indicates that there was a bit of this disruption, right? Because we were on this kind of trend, right? And then October 7th, kind of disrupted, I think, that trend. So I don't foresee that we're going to see a large percentage of Muslims voting for Donald Trump. But whether or not, to kind of use your phrase, that they continue kind of to revert back into the mean in, say, the 2026 midterms or the 2028 presidential election, I think that will be far more indicative of where the long-term trend line would be.
Got it. Okay. So I have a question, and it's actually also a question we got from the audience. So we are less than 50 days out from the
Mhm.
election now. And so obviously a lot of things are kind of locked in place. We've already had the presidential debate, all these things. But I'm not asking you to predict the future, but is there anything in your view that could change in the next 50 days? I mean, if
Yeah.
I'm not saying that it's going to happen, but if there was a ceasefire declared in
Yeah.
Gaza, if Kamala Harris changed a policy or made some sort of declaration, would that do you anticipate anything that could change these dynamics between now and then, or do you think it's pretty much already kind of baked in, and then it's more just kind of a question of we don't know what the outcome is? It's kind of Schrodinger's cat.
Yeah. I mean, it's not a nice position to be in, right? As most American Muslims are, where you feel politically homeless, right? So, that's not a position you value, right? That you would want for yourself. And so I think a lot of American Muslims are looking for any reason, right? To kind of latch on to the Democratic candidate. And it really would not have taken much. I genuinely think that if the state Democratic representative from Georgia was who happened to be Palestinian and would have endorsed Kamala Harris was able to speak during the DNC, I genuinely think like that would have been enough. Because then you could plausibly say, right, hey, folks, she can't kind of, do a complete 180 on Biden's policy while he's still in office and she's still the vice president. Give her time. Here's a good faith act on her part, right? Um, But we didn't even get that symbolic gesture. And so I think there is a lot of skepticism right now in terms of would she do something different, right, with regards to Gaza. Now, the question is that skepticism enough to get the majority of American Muslims to either vote third party or not vote in the election? If I had to guess, I would say right now it is enough. Now, between now and the election, I think there's going to be a lot of kind of weighing of various things. I don't think could there be a ceasefire? Sure, yes, anything is possible, right? But when Netanyahu very much sees it kind of against his self-interest to sign a ceasefire, particularly when he thinks there's this possibility that he might get a quote unquote better deal, right? If he just kind of holds off and potentially Donald Trump gets in office, I sincerely that we'll get a ceasefire. But if we get, perhaps some softening of the kind of unabashed intransigence when it comes to policy towards Israel, right? I mean, uh, American Muslims are not asking for much, right? Again, not just American Muslims, but Arabs and others of conscience. I mean, they're really just asking like, hey, abide by American law when it comes to sending weapons to countries that are plausibly engaging in genocide. I don't think that's too much. I don't think a lot of American Muslims think that's too much.
So I have one more question, and then we have time for a few audience questions. So, audience, if you have other questions, please put those in the chat. I've got a few already. Let as we kind of talked about this history, it seems like really within the last 25 years, we have a community that maybe there was a certain trend, a certain tendency that we could observe in the 2000 election towards maybe voting more Republican. But then there have been these two big disruptive events, right? September 11th in 2001, and then October 7th in 2023 that have kind of intervened and reconfigured Muslim politics, at least temporarily. So as we think post 2024, and thinking about these long-term trends, what are the indicators that you're looking at
Mhm.
for what will happen? I know you've already kind of referenced kind of some of the midterm elections, kind of 2028, but what are you kind of watching in this landscape for the larger trends for where the American Muslim vote is trending and tending towards?
Mhm.
And what are there any things that could happen in this election that you're like, oh, this is a very clear indicator, or will it be a muddle, do you think, for quite a while as all this gets sorted out?
So in your question, you kind of caught yourself for a second there. I think you were gonna say January 6th, and I would say that January 6th is also kind of in that list. Why? Because American Muslims are, embedded in the same, right? We didn't just fall from a date palm tree, right? We're in the same context as everybody else, and we have these social forces kind of acting upon us as well. And so what I when it comes to, how does a minoritized community gain some leverage, have their preferences, kind of brought to the fore, that can't but be through coalition building, right? You need, some sort of influence multiplier effect, right? And so that's why, typically, right, when you have minoritized communities, they're part of this kind of broader left of center coalition. But the left of center coalition, has certain values that may, kind of shape against, the kind of socially conservative values that a lot of Muslims are, kind of voicing these days. And so how does that kind of shape out, right? Like, who actually is part of the what coalition are American Muslims going to be a part of? I think that's what I'm, trying to look for here. And I think what scares me about this election cycle is because we have a woman of color, an African American and an Indian American woman of color, right? At the top of the ticket. I mean, you're going to have, some tensions between the American Muslim community and, a lot of, African American activists who are very much in support of Kamala Harris's presidency. And so we see these tensions now, and we see these tensions within the American Muslim community as well, right? Because we have a very large African American portion, right, of American Muslims. And so, how do American Muslims kind of reconcile, right, these kinds of forces that they're being kind of pulled and pushed in? You know, in a funny way, American Muslims are kind of the like ideal community in a Madisonian sense. We have so many kind of cross-cutting cleavages, right? So we are like the most American in that way. But you know, that's not exactly the ideal position to be in when, you know, latching on to a group and kind of, you know, pushing forward with a group is really how you kind of get ahead in American politics. And so how do Americans kind of square that circle, I think is something TBD, and hopefully we get some sense of that between now and November.
Yeah, it just strikes me that as you're saying, right, the American Muslim community is in some ways ideally positioned to exert leverage in American politics because they are so strategically distributed in the swing states. But it's a very vulnerable moment to do that, right? Because our politics are so polarized, and it could be very easy for one party or the other to then blame Muslims for the outcome of the election and then further kind of demonize and incite Islamophobia, right? So there's a real tension there that you're describing. Okay, so a few questions we've gotten from our audience. Somebody asked about this phrase "socially conservative,"
Mm,
and what do we mean when we say that the American Muslim community trends towards or leans towards a more socially conservative position? Or and maybe to expand the question a little bit, um, would if you just said you have a socially conservative Christian and a
mhm.
socially conservative Muslim, where would their values align and where might they not align? Or their definition of being socially conservative, where might that align and not align?
Sure. So I think that socially conservative, especially in today's context, I think hinges quite a bit on issues dealing with sexuality, issues dealing with gender identity. I think that's a fairly safe description within the like say kind of evangelical community, and with you know kind of folks you know groups like you know Moms for Liberty and other such groups. And to that extent, it's not much different, right, within the American Muslim community. I mean, I'll give you just kind of like one quick anecdote. So last June, so it was I think the summer of 2023 when a lot of this stuff was kind of boiling up. So last June, every single Friday sermon in my local mosque was dealing with LGBTQ issues, right? And so there was, I think this is becoming very much kind of top of mind, and I think this is the issue, right? Where like how American Muslims kind of reconcile living in a pluralistic society and holding these kind of socially conservative values on issues dealing with sexuality, on issues dealing with gender identity. How they do that, I think, is really going to kind of dictate what direction they kind of go in, both politically and socially.
Yeah, yeah. So another question we got is kind of about news sources
Hmm.
and where American Muslims look to for information about either the war in Gaza or American politics. Are there particularly influential news outlets that are directed towards American Muslims? Are there kind of thought leaders that are really guiding this, or are these kind of politics more kind of emerging organically from within the community? And then are just kind of getting reflected in our electoral politics. Can you point to specific kind of sources of information that are really influential and important?
I mean, I think that you know, American Muslims, particularly when it comes to anything happening outside of America, aren't wanting to. They don't exactly place a lot of stock in American news sources. And so, you know, Al Jazeera has been getting a lot of play. TikTok has been getting a lot of play as well, and you know, just social media kind of in general. And in terms of individuals here in America, I think you have Mehdi Hassan and Ayman Mohieddin. The latter still at MSNBC, the former effectively fired from MSNBC, and so Mehdi's kind of new platform, Zeteo, I think is attracting a lot of attention within the American Muslim community as well. But yeah, I mean, kind of go back to my point of, being nested kind of within, the context and all. Yeah, social media is a big, kind of source of information for better or worse, right? I mean, we do have to acknowledge that there is a lot of disinformation on those platforms.
Yeah. So we got a question that is, I think you touched on this as we were talking about the shift towards Kamala Harris and Tim Walz away from Joe Biden, but maybe we could go dig a little deeper in it. So is the fact that you now have an African American woman at the top of the Democratic ticket, has that introduced any new tensions between African American Muslims and the immigrant Muslim community? Like, has that kind of fractured that kind of demographic divide within the Muslim community, or accentuated it, or is it more that everyone is still more focused on kind of the foreign policy questions and less about kind of the identity of the candidate?
So I think foreign policy still holds the most sway. Just to kind of preview some data that I'm working on right now. So we fielded a survey of 1,200 American Muslims, and kind of we asked them, what issues are important to you, from not at all important to very important. And so among those very important issues, we then asked them, are any of these issues so important that if a candidate doesn't hold the same kind of view as you, is it a kind of deal breaker, right? And so for any number of issues regarding, kind of those socially conservative matters that we mentioned, or, climate change or healthcare access, all of those, the one issue voters were pretty much kind of clumped with each other, right? Like there wasn't much of a difference on any issue except on Gaza, way up there, right? So 80% of those who said that Gaza was a very important issue said it was basically a deal breaker. If you don't, like basically kind of hold, kind of my view in the sense of, trajectory of where things should go, then you don't deserve my vote. And so the way that this has kind of manifested within the American Muslim community, so there was actually a group that came about immediately after Joe Biden stepped down, called, I think it was American Muslim Women for Kamala Harris. My apologies if I'm not getting the name exactly right, but it's something along those lines. And then after the DNC and after basically refusing to allow Arua from Georgia to speak at the DNC, they effectively disbanded. They said we can't support Kamala Harris for president anymore. By that same token, though, there is another organization that is pretty nascent as well. I think it's the Black Muslim Civic Leadership, or Black Muslim Civic Leaders, something along those lines. Again, my apologies. I should probably have had this written down. Early on, they endorsed Kamala Harris, and they continue to endorse Kamala Harris. And they may be the only, frankly, American Muslim organization that has taken that position so openly and so assertively. So, is it fracturing the American Muslim community? I don't think so. Are there kind of cracks beginning to show? Then yeah, I think that is fair.
That's so interesting, because even in that one group that formed the American Muslim Women Voters for Harris, you see like that knife's edge of the
Yeah.
decision making, right? Like that they form the group to support her, but then after the DNC, like they don't see any change, and so they shift, right? Like that really does kind of highlight that tension within the community. That's really interesting. Okay, last question or two. Somebody asked about Muslim theology and
Hmm.
how Muslim theology, or maybe internal debates around theology, impact this. I mean, obviously, when we talk about the landscape of American Christianity, you can
Yeah.
really observe how, especially within Protestantism, but also within Catholicism, that these theological debates that are internal to our traditions often map onto our politics, right? And evangelicals tend to vote more Republican, whereas mainline Protestants tend to vote more Democratic. And then there's these divisions between liberal and conservative Catholics. Do you see a similar dynamic within the American Muslim community? Are there is the debate or any of these debates theologically rooted, or
Yeah.
are they more about kind of the tactical politics and foreign policy questions that are on the table?
I think theology plays a very large role, but not a very sophisticated role. Uh, and frankly, I think that might be a fair description for a number of religious communities in America. Theology is more of a heuristic, right? Like, and so you hear about the importance of Palestine, you hear about the importance of Jerusalem, right? In kind of weekly sermons, and that kind of, through osmosis, tends to kind of you kind of take that to heart, and then your beliefs, your preferences, your behaviors kind of reflect that. But I don't think there's kind of this deep reckoning with you know does this issue like really kind of balancing all the issues and thinking theologically, like should I think about the lesser of two evils, and in terms of timeline too, like if it's a lesser of two evils, like in the short term, does that trump it in the long term? I mean, so I don't think that conversation has been had. And I doubt it will be had. I think people are just focused, theologically driven in their zeal, but perhaps not necessarily but more kind of practically driven, right, in their kind of actions in terms of how to influence politics and how to kind of really articulate, right, their position on this most important issue to them.
Youssef, thank you. Thank you for spending your time with us and in educating us and helping us to understand all of these complicated dynamics of a very, very important community and very, very important factor in this election. So Youssef Chouhoud is a professor at Christopher Newport University. If you want to follow him, I just put the link to his personal website in the chat, so you can follow his scholarship. He's been doing a bunch of public writing recently as well. He's a good person to watch in this election season. So thank you again for being here. We really appreciate your time.
Thank you so much, Matt. Really great talking to you as always. We always have these great conversations, and it was nice to have kind of a conversation with a virtual audience this time around too. Thank you so much for the opportunity.